Wall Street did this to us because they're all greedy. And this is what happens when you have unfettered capitalism. Right? We need more government control. We need government regulation. We need Washington to make these decisions. We can't leave these decisions to the market. Washington needs to set prices and determine allocation of resources, and we need higher taxes and more government. That's the Obama school, right? And unfortunately, a lot of Republicans feel this way too. But then there's a correct way of looking at it, which is my way, which is that the government created these problems. That these are problems that the free market would have prevented if the market were free. That normally in a free market, people act responsibly. I mean, sure, people are greedy. Everybody wants to make money, but nobody wants to lose money. And I think the fear of loss is even more compelling than the greed for gain, especially for people who have money. I know they don't want to lose it. And so they're cautious in a free market. But when governments come in, they interrupt that caution. What happens is, people are reluctant to make loans imprudently because they might not get paid back. But what happens is the politicians don't like the fact that somebody can't borrow money. So they want to make sure that credit flows into areas where they want it to be, whether it's housing, whether it's minority businesses, whether it's student loans. And so the government steps in and says, oh, we'll guarantee these loans. Oh, they're guaranteed. Well, fine. Well, now no one cares. Now there's no more, the market mechanism is now short-circuited because the lender no longer cares about getting paid back. So he doesn't do the due diligence that he would normally do because the government guaranteed it. So now people get access to credit that never would have got it in a free market. And they do crazy things with it, and you have huge losses. Right? I mean, I often talk about the fact that, George Bush mentioned the fact that, the problem is because Wall Street got drunk, right? That wasn't the problem. Yeah, they were drunk, right? They were stinking drunk. But the whole country was drunk. It wasn't just Wall Street. Everybody was drunk, right? What they should have asked is, why did they get so drunk? Or where'd they get all this alcohol? Right? They're not always drunk. And the reality is, well, you had Alan Greenspan behind the bar, liquoring them all up. That's why they were drunk. So who are you blaming? Is it Wall Street for drinking the booze or the Fed for pouring it? That's the problem. If they hadn't poured it, then nobody would have been drunk. And so you had this failure of government. And we knew it was going to fail because it's always failed. And the problem is you had this toxic mix of moral hazard and free money, or nearly free money. Now the money is free, but back then it was only almost free. So when you had the Fed printing money like crazy and keeping interest rates at 1%, and the government guaranteeing all the reckless lending that was going on, you had a system that was ripe for fraud and abuse and corruption. Even the parts that were private got corrupted because of the cheap money and the free money. The rating agencies, the appraisers, everybody was tainted by this. And no one really looks at why it all happened, that it wasn't all an accident, right? When George Bush, right, when George Bush came to office in 2002, the situation was very similar to what Barack Obama walked into. He came into a situation where an asset bubble that was caused by the easy money of Alan Greenspan burst, right, just before he came into office. And rather than taking the opportunity to be responsible and level with the American public about all the problems that were created under Clinton and Greenspan, and saying, now we're going to have to atone for those sins. We're going to have to go through a rather severe bust because of all the problems of that boom. See, it's the boom where we make all the mistakes, right? That's when we're drunk and we do all the things that we shouldn't do. The recession is when we sober up and we realize, what we did wrong. And so we had a lot of problems. There were a lot of companies in the 1990s that rented office space and hired people that never should have started. And they never would have started had it not been for the cheap credit that financed them, because they certainly didn't have any profits. So they were non-viable businesses that never should have gotten off the ground, but they did. And people invested in them, and so they needed to lose money, and people made decisions based on wealth that didn't really exist. And so we should have had a pretty bad recession. Also, the terrorists attacked us on 9/11, and that was a big problem. And now all of a sudden we had another threat that we didn't know about. We had to defend ourselves from more terrorists. We had to spend more money to make the country safer. We had to maybe pursue the terrorists on foreign soil. All that was going to cost money. So instead of President Bush leveling with the American public and saying, you know what, we spent too much, we borrowed too much, now is the time to save, now is the time to work hard and sacrifice and roll up our sleeves and stop spending money because we don't have it and we need money for the war on terror. No, what did he do? He actually went on television and said, go out and buy a new car, spend money, go into debt. At a time when we're broke and having to fight a war, he's telling us to go into debt. And what did he do? Did he allow the recession to happen? No. He wanted to fight the recession. And that is the problem of American politics. The politicians don't want the recession because the voters don't like it. The voters like the boom. They like to be high, right? They want more drugs. The politicians don't want to take the drugs away. So they go in there and they try to fight off the recession, even though the recession is the cure. So what they're resisting is the cure, and they're worsening the disease. And they worsen it with stimulus. Right? They call it stimulus. It sounds good, but it's toxic. The stimulus is the problem. So what was the stimulus, right, that Bush used? How did we get out of that 2001, 2002 recession? Well, we did the same thing that Barack Obama and Ben Bernanke are doing now. We cut interest rates from 5.5% down to 1%, right? And we started spending money we didn't have. The government started running deficits. They had small surpluses, if you don't count the Social Security stuff, but we had surpluses. And they decided to cut taxes and increase spending, and deficit spending and cheap money. That was their stimulus. And what did they stimulate? The economy? No. They stimulated a housing bubble. That's what they stimulated. And they really prevented the market from addressing the structural economic imbalances in our economy. In fact, they made those imbalances worse. We went on this giant consumption binge. We borrowed trillions of dollars from everybody all around the world. And we blew it. We spent the money. We bought products we didn't make. We bought houses we couldn't afford. We remodeled them. We put granite on all the countertops, and we put jacuzzi tubs in there, and all sorts of things. But we can't pay the money back. We didn't borrow the money and build factories. We can't produce products and sell them and pay off the debt. It was a giant, spending binge because we were diluted with all this cheap money. We thought we were rich. We thought we could afford all this money because we all lived in big mansions. And these houses were going to keep magically appreciating forever. And they were just going to be like ATM machines. We didn't need a job. We didn't need to save our money. No, we just had to buy a house. And we were on Easy Street. And if you really wanted to make it easy, you bought 2 or 3 houses. The more the better. I know, lenders didn't care. So we had this giant, that was what we got from the stimulus, right? It interfered. And when that stimulus wore off, 2007, 2008, now we got the payback, right? What happened? Everything that happened in 2008, the credit crunch, the dropping in home prices, the foreclosures, the bankruptcies, none of that was the problem. All of that was the solution. And it was all the consequence of the problem. The problem was the phony bubble. The problem was not real estate prices coming down. No. The problem was real estate prices going up. That never should have happened. The problem isn't that some Wall Street firms are failing. They never should have been doing what they were doing in the first place. There's a lot of businesses a lot of these retailers are going out of business, but they never should have been started because we can't afford all this stuff. Because we don't make it and we don't have any savings. We're consuming too much. We just found out last week that GDP spending just hit a record 71% of GDP. It's like the post-World War II record. We're spending more. We got to spend less. We're in debt up to our eyeballs. Why are we spending more money? Right? We're in a crisis because we spent money we didn't have.